Wonderful. Well, then let's go ahead and get rolling. We, again, appreciate everyone taking the time here this afternoon to join us, or I guess morning for some. And really, the context behind today's webinar itself was stemming from a conversation Dave and I had really about a month and a half ago around just some of the things we'd been seeing in market. This strategic planning has always been something very near and dear to the hearts of us here at Elate, as well as Velocity Advisory Group. And I think one of the things we're seeing, which we're certainly going to touch on, is just the challenges organizations are feeling and seeing right now as it relates to strategic planning. And in particular, I would say the commonalities we're seeing and a lot of complexity and overcomplication being applied to the process itself. And so often it's warranted of getting back to the basics and simplifying things to then move forward. And that's the intent of today's session itself. And so for those that don't know, we'll introduce ourselves here in a moment, but to give you a little bit of a high level for today's agenda and what to expect, we'll certainly start with welcomes and introductions, but then we want to get into the big picture. We want to first look at those current market trends that we're seeing from the hundreds of organizations that we work with, thousands of strategy and operations leaders that we've talked to over the years, and speak to how those market trends themselves are really impacting the state of strategic planning. We think it's always helpful to start with that big picture and give the context itself before then starting to apply tactical application to how do we invest, how do we change the way that strategic planning comes to life and is really built for success within our organizations themselves. So we'll get into those best practices, how to simplify, and suggestions that we have, followed by Q&A. We will try to, as best that we can, as we have questions coming in throughout in the chat, get to those during our session, but we certainly want to carve out some time at the end today for that Q&A within the 45 minutes or so that we have here. So with that, let's get into a little bit of introductions. For those that don't know, my name is Brooks Bush. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO here at Elate. Elate is a strategic planning software built to bring together long-term vision and tactical execution in a holistic way, where organizations are building, executing, and reporting on their overall strategic plan and the delivery of that strategy itself. And I'm joined by Dave, who we have had the pleasure of working with at Velocity now for, it's coming up to almost a year now since we first got introduced, but I'll let you quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Brooks. So we at Velocity really have been doing strategic planning now for close to 15 years. And we're going to talk about where strategic planning has come from and where it's going over the last decade or so. But we really proceed even where we're starting on this. So we at Velocity do three things. We tie together the intersection between strategy, leadership development, and culture, and how all these things play together. And one of the things that we love about the Elate platform is, in one simple view, you tie together through technology these important things and keep it front and center. So we really appreciate that and are looking forward to today's topic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's exactly why I'm so excited, because Dave, you've seen this, you've seen the ebbs and flows that come with the strategic planning. You've seen the ebbs and flows that come as it relates to just cycles themselves. And so that's the perspective I'm excited for. I think oftentimes one of the challenges that we see within organizations that we work with is pulling in that unbiased third party to really guide the direction itself to how do we build this strategy in a way where we're bringing all of those voices together. And that is kind of what we'll speak to certainly with that partnership itself and how we work with Velocity. So that all being said, Dave, you've kind of already touched on this. You all have been doing this for a while now. We wanted to give a lay of the land and the trends that we've seen over the last 10 years or so that inform where we are today as a market.
Yeah, I mean, this timeline, I think, is really telling. And there's a few things I'd like to point out on it, but we really began doing this all the way back in 2009. So it's been really approaching 15 years now. And if you look at the beginning of this timeline, you see that it starts with a high level of predictability. But before that, what preceded that was also times of uncertainty, similar to what we have now. Just a quick aside, Brooks, you started your company on the right foot. When Velocity got into the strategic planning business, we actually hadn't done a lot of it before, and went to Barnes & Noble and bought Strategic Planning for Dummies for strategic planning, whatever that book is, the yellow books. because we really didn't understand how simple this could be. And having done now 700 of these and having our own proprietary approach to it, these levels of uncertainty that we find in this timeline is generally when you really want to lean in and become more forward thinking and more strategic. So back in 2014 to 2019, it's a long period of time. Things were pretty consistent. And what we saw was a deviation away from strategic planning. People were really leaning on the successes that they saw and how predictable things were becoming for them. And they just focused on tactics. They just focused on day-to-day operations and just being highly tactical. And it worked until this crazy thing came along around early March of 2020, when everything was turned on its head. Businesses had to adjust quickly, and true chaos ensued in Q1, towards the end of Q1 of 2020 with COVID. So the global pandemic, this shift to remote working, which has completely revolutionized and changed the way people work, and really not just technology spend, but spend in general, really ramped up. People were trying to figure out how to be more optimized and more streamlined in these new conditions. The 21 to early part of last year, it was really an interesting time because the workforce itself had shifted. You see the Gen Zs entering the workplace. You see organizations really shifting from chasing talent to at the end of that time frame, really trying to figure out what their talent situation looked like and how they can do a lot more with less. And that time frame was really neck-breaking change. So even though the 2020 phase was chaos, there was a high level of trying to figure out what the new norm is, and that language, the new norm, really prevailed during that time frame. But what we've seen now in our current state, which we're calling the uncertainty phase, organizations really are looking for clarity and direction. They're trying to figure out what's next. You have the emergence of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is really, really on every organization that we work with's mind, regardless if they're a tech company or not. The optimism that you see is really mixed with high levels of caution. There's a belief that within an election year and some of these other things that are going on, there's things to be optimistic for, but there's much more at an economic standpoint, at a macro level, global conditions, different wars going on, that people are really trying to figure out, what are these impacts on my business, and how can I align everyone within my business to move forward? If you look at this timeline, one other observation I made when we were putting this together with you, Brooks, is you would hope that it would be predictable periods of time, 5-year chunks of time or 1-year periods of time. But what we're seeing is these phases from stability to uncertainty and chaos and all these different phases. It's really hard to determine how long each of these phases are going to last. These timelines are going to last, which is even more reason why people have to figure out now how to be more strategic and plan for a little bit further into the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's spot on. These things typically go in waves, right? And between 2007 and 2009, a lot of unpredictability that then led to, okay, the time of consistency after the fact. I think we're entering or have been in that time of uncertainty. There will inevitably become more predictability that comes on the heels of this. But I think if we look at the broader landscape, and this is certainly the case with a lot of the organizations that we work with, is this level of uncertainty is manifesting in the conversations that are starting at the highest level. I think boards of directors themselves are challenging organizations to get back to the core of the business. What was it that was working? You see this focus on innovation. I think between that 2014 and 19 timeframe, a lot of companies themselves, whether it was a surplus of capital, whether it was just growth rates that were just continuously year over year compounding, folks started to get, I won't call it cute by any means, but they were starting to test the waters of, okay, well, what can we expand into? And I think now, as we think about the market today, a lot of the boards themselves and how they're pressing onto leadership are saying, hey, let's do the thing that we're really good at and not lose sight of that. And so that is just one thing I think this speaks to as well, is just the growth and then the pruning back of, okay, what do we want to focus on?
Absolutely. And one of the things is you don't want to just leave it up to happenstance. You want to be intentional about this whole process because today's session is all about bringing clarity. Clarity will emerge one way or another. And if you're not intentional about bringing that clarity, outside factors and maybe people in your organization that have strong opinions are going to shape that clarity for you versus the organization taking control of it and really predetermining the next future state. So yeah, I agree, Brooks.
Spot on. And I think dovetailing off of that, the folks that see that uncertainty the most are the ones that are closest to the operating plan and then how that operating plan is put into place through the strategy itself. And I think leaders and employees are feeling that disconnect between strategy and execution, mainly the strategists that are responsible for building how is it we're going to go out and achieve those goals. If we look at some of these numbers, 75% of strategists themselves cite a gap between, or a concern, I should say, between the execution gap of the long-term vision and the execution. 85% of executives themselves are spending less than an hour reviewing their overall strategy. So you have strategy leaders themselves saying, look, raising the alarms or sounding the alarms, saying, look, there's a gap here, there's a disconnect. C-level executives are so inundated, so focused on, okay, what do I have to prioritize now, that they're not stepping back and understanding the overall strategy and the different dependencies themselves that exist across the organization. And that's leading to the majority, 52%, or I should say over half of C-suite executives saying that they aren't prepared for the expected pace of change. Accenture did a report saying almost 90%, I think it was 88% of executives expect the pace of change within their business to accelerate over the coming year. And 52% don't feel prepared to actually embrace that change. And I think this is speaking to when we have uncertainty, the folks that need to be able to provide that clarity itself start with the folks on this webinar, strategy and operations leaders that understand the business inside and out.
The two on here, the one on the far left, the 75%, that statistic, I've seen that statistic as high as 90%, as low as like 65%. Execution's always been the problem with strategy. That's not a new story. That one's been a test of time. I'm sure one of the reasons why you guys founded Elate, because you've got some great remedies to keep that top of mind. But the two that just don't align are those, the middle one and the one on the right. How can you, if everyone's saying, whoa, change is coming way too fast, it's unpredictable, but we're only going to spend an hour a month focused on all this change. I mean, that's the common reality. And that's why so many organizations feel very reactive. They don't have a pulse of what the future state's going to be. I'm not talking about outside of the organization. I'm talking about even within their organization. How can you spend an hour a month and cry over the fact that the change is coming so quickly that you don't have your arms wrapped around it? Those two things have to come together in order for proper change and intentionality to come to fruition.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this actually ties in nicely to where we're going to go with this. But the thing that it frankly wasn't that surprising to me, but one of the stats that I saw was that in 2023, there was a 55% increase in the turnover of CEOs within organizations. And I think market conditions themselves certainly play a role. I think fatigue is certainly something as well. But it was just under, I think, 2,000 CEOs left their businesses or their organizations last year. That was an increase off of like 1,200 the year before. And I think this level of uncertainty we're seeing, or even the level of focus or disconnect of the focus of reviewing the strategy, starts at the top. I mean, we talked about board of directors, most of which are reevaluating the organizations themselves, the business plan, the operating model. But if there's that turnover that's occurring through so many of the companies that we work with, we just had this conversation a couple of weeks ago of a co-founding CEO stepping out of the business because it's now shifted from innovate, all of the different ideation that was something that was core to their business to, okay, we need to drive to profitability. That's the focus. That is a different leader that we're going to put in place. But that disconnect in the vision or the new vision that's being put in place. And so that's kind of where we wanted to start this conversation is it does start at the top. It's setting that true north of where do we want to go, whether it's an existing leadership team, validating and reconfirming that this is still what we are setting out to achieve, or if it's capturing in a meaningful way that new narrative for CEOs stepping into the role. This part of the process, I think some folks feel like is just fluff or is a nice to have, but it is so critical in how we actually align our strategy with an operating plan itself.
I love the way Tim designed this slide. It's all about setting your true north. And if there's anything I want all the listeners on today's webinar to really pay attention to is these are absolutely foundational pillars that you have to have in order to build strategy. Imagine that you don't really know your current day why, or that you set your mission and vision 15, 20 years ago, and it sits in a drawer on your website or in some employee handbook somewhere. Organizations have to know their mission, vision, and their values in order to design proper strategy. Just last week, we met with an organization we're working on their strategy in August, I believe, but we went all the way back and redesigned their mission and vision statements because those are going to inform their why, and where they're going are going to inform the strategy that they're going to build back in August. So, or coming up in August. These things are foundational. And again, I love what you said. This is anything but fluff, but organizations that treat these things like fluff also are not bringing that right level of clarity down to their employees, let alone their customers and their other stakeholders. Yeah, this is important stuff.
Yeah. And I think kind of as we shift into this concept, right? We talked about how do we take a process like strategic planning, which when we were first founding Elate, we wrote every step of what we thought entailed strategic planning. So building the strategy, executing, reporting on it, filled up a whole wall within the room that we were working in because it's a very complicated process that has a lot of moving pieces. Frankly, it looks a little bit different for every organization. However, we said, hey, we want to provide just a level of intuitiveness and consistency in how we set the strategy that as we then want to add on to it, we have a strong foundation to come back to, which this kind of shifts us into the framework itself that we want to recommend and we want to put in front of folks that are looking for that ability to bridge the gap between long-term vision and tactical execution in a simple way. First thing we're always going to recommend is this left hand, mission, vision, values. Dave's touched on this. Like this is something that should be prevalent throughout everything else we're going to build within the strategy that's going to sit on the right side of things, but that has to come first. The other thing that it just surprises me to no end when I'll get into a room with a company and like we talk about operational metrics, we talk about an operating plan, and I ask like, hey, what is the singular metric that you care most about? Is it revenue? Is it profitability? Is it burn? What is it? And they can't narrow it down to just a single one or even just a handful of them. They show these dashboards, these BI tools with just data point after data point, and that's great, but we need to be able to start to hone in on what is the operational metric we are driving towards. And then we build what we refer to here at Elate as themes to drive and to help us achieve those. Again, we believe in like an operating plan exists. That's what we communicate to our board of directors. That's what we're agreeing to as a company. The strategy aligns that operating plan with the execution. And for us, that's what these annual themes, some organizations call them pillars, but they're set annually because they drive us towards those operating metrics themselves.
Before you click through, because I know there's some other things that are going to pop up. These things, Brooks, I think we are fully aligned on. These shouldn't change regularly. These are some things that bring some stability to the organization. When you have clarity on your mission, vision, values, those operational metrics that are overarching, it's not departmental, it's not a person's specific goals or their metrics that they're measured against, but the overarching measures of success or the measure of success for the organization. And what you call themes, we use a little bit different vernacular at Velocity. We call them priorities, but they're the exact same concept. Those things are very static. And organizations that carry those forward in a strategic way, what you're about to pop up, those are the things that are the day-to-day change. Those are the things that really bring your plan to life. So I think you're going to, is this the slide that clicks forward?
It is, yeah.
All right.
The thing I'll do before I do all the fun click through is that, or actually I'll do it as I'm kind of speaking. When we think about what are those examples, you're going to be able to see these underneath. But One thing we're seeing right now is just every organization, not every organization, that's a broad categorization, but so many companies right now just care about top line revenue, or how are we getting to that? How are we impacting or influencing it? And that is important. If that's what the priority is of that business itself, amazing. We need to be communicating it. We need to be rallying around it. But oftentimes what I think occurs is that we set a revenue target and then everything just becomes a sales driven mentality of just like, how do we serve sales? And that's it. Like, we care about revenue, we care about that no business number or growth number. But the beauty behind when we can rally around a singular operating metric is then we can start to connect different departments in a way where it starts to rally them around, hey, why are we building this net new product feature?
Right.
Influencing revenue. Why are we caring about our customer experience and journey to increase upsells or overall net revenue retention? There has to be a meaning. And that's where these themes for us come in, is like, these are themes that we can rally around across different areas so that it isn't just a singular focus on revenue and that feeling where we're ignoring other parts of the business, but instead saying, hey, how do we bring these all together to drive towards, in a measurable way, this singular focus we have?
One of the things I admire about your platform that you've built, and I think is fully aligned with our methodology as well, as these themes, organizations shouldn't have a dozen of them. These themes should be a handful, 3, 5. And that, to align an entire organization around 3 to 5 overarching themes, that takes intentionality as well. But again, the purpose of this webinar is bringing clarity. And if you don't have these pieces together that you have up on the screen right now, if organizations can't get clarity on that, everything that you're going to click forward through, it's going to be vague, and you're going to have people running in different directions. So this is the overarching view that brings that level of clarity. And we'll talk about, I know in a few minutes, how to do all this, but everyone should know you should have the operational metric or metrics and no more than 3 to 5 overarching themes. That's going to bring alignment and clarity.
Spot on. Yeah, I couldn't
Yeah.
say it better. And it's like that refinement, that focus on just 3 to 5 of those is really hard to do. But again, it's why having that outside voice, like asking the question,
Yeah.
what is mission critical versus what is a nice to have, is so important in how velocity comes alongside organizations. I will say there are plenty of studies on this. Harvard Business Review did one. Less than 5 employees on average within an organization actually know the strategy itself of that company.
Yeah.
So us on the call, one thing I always like to reiterate is, like, we as strategy and operations leaders, this is where we live day to day. We know this stuff, we understand it, but there is a large gap between what we know and what we live day in and day out and what our employees know, right? We have to be communicating these. We have to be really clear about this if we want our folks to understand what we are trying to achieve together. And that then flows into the next piece, which is, okay, here's the strategy. Here's what we want to do. Let's start talking about how we get there. This is where things like objectives and you can insert acronym XYZ, OKRs, whatever it is. But the intent is that objectives, oftentimes set on a quarterly basis, they are measurable with clear outcomes, or tactics, which we think of as like outcomes are very quantifiable. This is the revenue target, or this is the number we are looking to hit. Tactics are more like progress to complete, or projects that reinforce those objectives themselves. But this is the how. This is where those employees that we need to understand the strategy are having ownership of connection to the strategic plan in and of itself. And if we think about what these can look like expanding into an enterprise market, right? That's one of the objectives that we are focused on to get to that revenue target, exceeding $2 million. Very clear. This is the goal that we have. Tactic. We need to develop a sales playbook for our enterprise market as we continue to grow into it. But these are like examples that we see come into place that we want to have ownership again at that employee level, which means they need to understand the strategy in a clear way.
Yeah, and you go back to the statistic on a previous slide, 75% of organizations fail when it comes to executing strategy. Largely, that's because the strategic plans have been poorly designed or have not gone through the proper process, which I know you're going to share in a second. But if you look at this slide before we even move forward, the things that occur at a rapid pace are the green and purple boxes. Those are the ones that are your responses to your current market conditions. Those are your current state actions and things that your activity that you're doing. But those blue and I'm not really great at colors, teal, I guess. Is that fair?
Yeah, we'll
Ocean
go with that.
seafoam green. I don't know, but those things have to remain static and at least for a period of time, whatever the timeline that you determine those need to be, no less than a year, likely closer, maybe 3 years. But yeah, I love this slide. And I think it's a great example that you used for sure. Yep.
Yeah, one of the things I love that you all do is kind of like not just breaking into milestones, those tactics themselves,
Yeah.
but the accountability piece of it. I think that is something the market is very much being pushed towards is, again, we talk about board of directors, pressing on leadership, pressing down. It is such a renewed focus on accountability and measurement of, are we delivering on the things we said we were going to deliver on? And I think the accountability aspect of these things in purple is really important. And again, if like, we're setting these and like 5 people own a specific tactic or an outcome, does anyone really own it, right? It gets
Well,
back.
I was just going to touch on that. I hadn't heard that. You said it was a Harvard Business Review study. I hadn't heard that, but imagine, I know it to be true anecdotally. If only 5 people are responsible for your strategy and they're just focused on this green and purple phase, they're doing it without purpose. They're doing it and it's not creating alignment. And that's one of the reasons why organizations lack clarity is because 5 people know the blue box and everyone else is running wild on the green and purple boxes. And that's just going to create chaos and confusion. So yeah, you have to share that article with me, Brooks. I'd like to read it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we start here. Like this is the framework itself that we want to orient around, that we recommend. If you're looking for a place to start to simplify it, this is it. As we think about what we're all coming up, not all of us, but again, the fall is very much strategic planning season as we head into the second half of the year, as we go into a new fiscal year for a lot of organizations, they're starting to think about, okay, well, how do I get this introduced within my organization? Which is where annual planning and this cycle itself, that if we're just starting with the basics themselves, the bare essentials, this is oftentimes what we recommend, this flow. We do this with organizations, but this is where I see Velocity just excel and how they partner alongside organizations themselves. We've kind of started with this idea of, okay, we got to establish this framework. What is the form in which we're going to build our strategy and create that structure around? And then it moves into the whole seasonality of it. And we've got our offsite planning playbook. What that simply refers to is just like the rules of the road. What are the expectations we have for the offsite itself? Who's going to be there? What are the things we're looking to accomplish? But the things going into the offsite and the offsite, I feel like so often is just where folks start and stop, and that's kind of where they live. Versus what you'll see on this chart is that the majority of the work comes after the fact in a lot of these cases. And I know, Dave, this is something we touched on a little bit coming into this session today.
Yeah, we're purposeful not putting a timeline on this because there's a lot of things here that don't apply to every organization. Some organizations don't have boards, so you can skip the board of directors plan approval as an example. But most of these things really begin and end. Most organizations that we've worked with, the ones that do this on their own in particular, that self-perform, they really focus on the plan design, which is what they consider the offsite. They have flip charts hanging up all over the place and they're excited and they put together usually a PowerPoint presentation or an Excel spreadsheet. But really, if you try to fast track the plan design and validation phase, you're going to disenfranchise different departments, or people in your organization aren't going to feel a sense of ownership. And they're going to say, oh, that's their plan. And they're going to point to those 5 people from your article and go, oh, that's their plan. They're not going to feel any connectivity to the plan if they're not tied into the process before the very last bullet point, you actually launch the plan. My favorite bullet point on this one is the rituals established. That's what I love because every organization does execute differently based on their geography, based on how complex, if it's a global organization, a multi plants, if it's a manufacturer, the way that you do this and the rituals and the way that you communicate and the way that you um, you really go about some of the key things I think we're going to share on the very next slide. Those are really, really important for organizations to know what uniquely makes them tick. And if you ignore that phase and you don't weave it in, the execution, which is really what begins after you launch the plan, you're going to be in that 75% that do a poor job. The organizations that acknowledge their rituals and do this process properly, they're in that 25% minority that do a really good job of executing.
Yeah, and we had a question come in of, do you have some folks that you work with that are exceptions to the rule, that are spending a little bit more than an hour per month actually reviewing the strategy, that are staying laser focused on the execution? And I would say, like, first off, if we want to look at why those organizations are successful in actually addressing the strategy and staying consistent with it and knowing when to persist with the strategy or pivot, it's because they've established the rituals for how often they review those, what they review. One of the things that we see time and time again is the idea of this, like a pre-read going into those meetings themselves. If we can circulate all of the necessary information to an ELT, an executive leadership team, prior to a meeting, what we're able to do is give everyone the necessary information they need heading into it, so that we're not spending the time in that meeting itself just simply doing roll call. Is your objective on pace, behind, at risk? Everyone already knows that. What we're focusing the conversation on is, for those things at risk or behind, how do we intervene? How do we remove hurdles from our employees or bring down the barriers that oftentimes serve as blockers for cross-departmental initiatives being successful? Or how do we double down on the things that are working? But that idea of a pre-read, most organizations aren't able to do it because the idea of pulling together those reports in Excel and PowerPoint every single week and the amount of hours spent trying to do that is just not feasible. And so that idea of streamlining even the way that we're bringing this necessary information, what we think of as Elate as like the signals being placed through your business,
Yeah.
bring those signals together and drive that ability to have that information shared ahead of the meeting itself. That's where we see folks that are successful, as they establish those rituals to begin with.
Yeah, I'll make one comment on the pivot. I don't know who asked that, but it was a great statement or question. If only 5 people in your organization truly understand your strategy, if that is true generally, when they're pivoting from the plan, they understand they're making a pivot. They're responding to a market condition, but everyone else in the organization that's not part of the strategy ownership, they just look at it as knee-jerk reactions or being overly opportunistic. But if you're not getting the strategy really cascaded throughout the organization, you realize you're pivoting, but everyone else thinks you're being reactive. So this is really important to get right.
Yeah, there was one other question. I was going to address it at the end, but I think it kind of touches on this, which is, when we were going to the timeline slide of like how a global pandemic just threw everything into chaos, it's the question of like, well, how do we plan for that in the future? And I think this idea of, do we have an agreed upon structure today, that helps lend itself to whether or not we can sustain a global pandemic in the future. Like, do we have rituals established? Do we have a way that we structure our meetings that isn't dependent upon us all being in the same room, going through roll call, writing things down on pen and paper, but instead saying, look, we have a structure and a process where we're actually being proactive in this versus reactively just waiting till everybody's in the same room, having these conversations, and just happen to stumble over the fact that, oh, this product feature that we were anticipating being released to our enterprise sales team to help increase contract values 15% just got delayed by a month because we had 3 contractors that we had to let go of from budgeting perspective. A lot of those conversations, they happen only because you get into a room, and that's where we're trying to, in essence, streamline those conversations so that, again, in the meeting, we're talking about solutions to the problem versus just uncovering the problem to begin with.
Yeah. 100% agree.
We've talked about the framework. We've given a high level on the planning itself. The last piece of this is then, okay, we've built our plan, we've rolled it out to the company itself. how do we stay tried and true to actually delivering on it, to doing what we said we would? And that's the idea of moving from planning to execution, getting back to the basics with that idea of like people, process, and a solution for how we bring it all together. And for us, there's three market drivers that Dave and I wanted to touch on that we're consistently seeing across the board. First of which being autonomy to execute through clarity. And this goes back to that metric that we referenced of 75% of strategists cite the execution gap being a concern. And one of the things that we really hone in on is this idea of a unified view where leaders and employees themselves know where to go to prioritize their work. Priority fatigue is very much a real thing. And I think it's frankly only going to get worse as there's a continuation in reduction in headcount, budgets that are being frozen, reduction in spend itself on technology. Folks are going to feel that more and more often. And so what we need to do as leaders, especially on the strategy side, is give them a way that they can level set on what are the priorities that the business cares about that I can then align my work to. One of the things that we talk a lot about is when organizations try to do this prioritization piece through like spreadsheets or through goal tracking or performance management, oftentimes what you're going to have is come hell or high water, a individual marching towards what they said they were going to do at the beginning of the quarter because that's how they're hired, fired, bonus.
Sure.
What we want to recommend is, okay, how do we make this much more of a dynamic approach? How do we make this something where folks are aligning directly their work and prioritization of work to the overall strategy versus just saying, I'm going to do this thing because it's what I said I was going to do. And when I have that manager review in a quarter, I want to be able to say I did it, where the reality is that's not actually allowing us to better deliver or execute upon the strategy itself.
I would comment on this one. At the speed of change, which is what we're talking about, I think on some of the future bullet points, if your employees don't feel aligned or connected to the strategy, if there really is that level of disconnect that you shared, they're not going to understand their why and their meaning towards the company's goals and objectives. They're going to go to work and do a job every day that they're not going to fully understand what the impact is. And, there's the old story, are you a mason or are you building a cathedral, right? And these folks oftentimes every day are doing something without fully understanding how they've aligned to that the operational metric or those themes. Once you provide that clarity, you get a little bit more discretionary effort out of your team. You get a little bit more collaboration out of your team. And if folks are able to really better connect to themselves and the organization when they have this in place. So 100% aligning with you on this one.
Yeah. Yeah, we couldn't agree more. And I think as we think about this one as we talk about the second market driver is this idea of like proactivity and consistency in how we're reviewing it. This isn't just like hey, David and Brooks are trying to talk about the fact that strategy leaders and executive teams themselves need to spend more time here because this is the world that we play in. The numbers themselves justify this. There's projected to be over $70 billion spent by 2030 on enterprise planning and transformation. Like this is a thing that companies are trying to solve for. They're spending dollars on it. It's projected to have 14% annual growth from 2023 to 2030. We're trying to figure out how to solve this, right? And a lot of it comes because there's an overcomplication in the processes themselves and folks trying to iron that out. But in large part, where we hit those hurdles or roadblocks is we can't get the right folks to actually pay attention to this because they're distracted with the things that are not part of our strategy, or it's just so manual and we're just trying to throw more and more process at it that we're not establishing that operating rhythm to drive a proactivity and a review process that we've spoken to. And so this is where we just cannot speak highly enough to, again, agreeing to those rituals at the onset and shifting from doing those roll call sessions, doing that reactive approach to how do we solve this to more proactively thinking about the things that are going to impact our business. And I know, Dave, this is something you all do, whether it's SWOT analyses or market analysis of just understanding the lay of the land, where you're at today. But companies can't skip that process. You can't just pretend without doing the homework and the analysis to understand what's happening in the broader economic landscape as well.
Yeah, I know this to be true. Just, we also do executive coaching, so we work with all these executives, not just on designing and executing upon strategy, but how they go about leading their companies. I know this to be true, and I say this is true for a few reasons. The proactive, consistent review clearly is what the behavior needs to be to do this correctly. But the bigger overarching problem, I think, and why organizations struggle with this is strategy is daunting for them. It's adjacent to, it's not integrated into what they do every day. So they see we build this big, hairy, scary plan, and
Hmm.
let's just check against it once a month to see how it's doing. And instead of it daily or hourly or minute by minute informing what everyone's doing, I think it was blue and purple boxes on that previous slide, or green and purple boxes on their daily activities, what they're doing every day. How does that over align to the themes and the metrics that we're really marching towards? There's a major disconnect because it seems heavy, it seems
Hmm.
daunting, and it's not. If you do it correctly, it absolutely is your rudder. But when you do it, the plan sits adjacent to the way you operate every day, it's doomed for failure. So this one, again, I know that to be true, and it's self-inflicted wound, why organizations struggle with this one.
Yeah. I think there's a
Yeah.
cultural element to it. And I was just having
Mm.
this conversation literally yesterday with a customer, and I will not take credit for this, but the way that she broke this down was pretty simple. And it goes back to the enterprise planning and transformation is the journey from vision to operationalizing, right? Like that is what we're trying to bring
Yeah.
to life within our organizations. And I think oftentimes as strategy leaders, we ourselves can fall victim to just living in the big picture and not understanding the importance of transforming that vision, that strategy into meaningful context to our employees. And if we don't do that, no one else within the organization is going to. We have to move and serve as that connective tissue, bringing together vision and how it's operationalized within the business itself.
She's very wise.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree.
Yeah.
Last thing we got is that dynamic approach. And this is where making sure that we are prepared for the pace of change. Things will not get slower, right? They are going to get faster. And if we want to cut through the noise, that idea of simplicity, of establishing a plan in and of itself that is intuitive, that is durable, that does bring us the opportunity on a regular cadence to ask, do we persist or pivot? If we can't answer that, if we don't have that in a forum or a format, I should say, where we as a leadership team can consistently bring that up, relate it to our employees, have whether it's town halls or monthly company emails. If we can't do that, all that's going to happen is that the noise is going to get louder for those employees, especially for, let's call it, the foreseeable future, the coming months, because I don't think anyone's predicting that the markets are just going to overnight turn and just get really soft and really easy for everyone. I think we're still in a season where we have to be laser focused on what are the things that matter most for our business. How do we set those priorities? How do we get good at saying not now to certain things that aren't bad ideas, but aren't necessarily imperative to what we are trying to go out and execute upon? And I think this idea of establishing a planning framework that is intuitive, that is durable, is really important versus, again, the more complexity you add to it, there's a bit of fragility that comes with complexity. And Dave, you talked about earlier, like that whiplash that employees feel,
Yeah.
that's only going to get worse the more complicated it is. So I do think that this is something that, again, if I think about how I know you all come alongside organizations, like that durability within a plan, that persist or pivot concept is something that you all do really well.
Yeah, again, I love how you tied the statistics together from the previous slide into the suggested strategies. Hopefully that is bringing clarity to everybody. But I'll point this out on this one. If you're, or let me back up. Culture itself has really evolved in the business workplace has really evolved over the last 5 to 10 years. And the way that the organizations listen to their employees. So forever you would do an annual survey or Gallup Q12 or whatever platform you used, you would listen to your employees annually, maybe twice a year. Now the movement is towards pulsing and really listening to your employees throughout the year. So as people or organizations are acknowledging, these 52% of executives are acknowledging the speed of change, why are they approaching strategic planning the same way? Why are they setting it up annually and maybe checking it monthly for an hour, which is what the statistic above it says, when things are way more dynamic than that? It just seems so reckless and scary to me that organizations are still functioning that way. So culturally, they understand, hey, we have to listen to our employees regularly and often and respond to it, yet they're still addressing their strategy annually or quarterly, and they're not doing it in a more dynamic way. It just seems so antiquated and dangerous. And at the speed of change, your competitors that aren't operating like you are going to leave you in the dust because they're adapting and adjusting regularly and keeping everybody aligned, which is one of the spirits of today's call. So,
Yeah.
yeah, love it.
Okay, I know we're getting close to the time that we asked for the session itself. Obviously, if you have Q&A or questions, I should say, that you want to drop in the chat, feel free to do so. One of the items, though, that we got also brought up, Dave, and I think this is just a more broadly spoken topic, is just what are some of the common mistakes we see organizations make when it comes to strategic planning? I think there's certainly a lot of mistakes that we all make, without question. From our perspective, I think Dave's touched on it a little bit, of like that idea of we set the strategy and then it lives on the shelf, never to be revisited again, or it just lives in the background. I think that idea of bringing the strategy to life, bringing an ability to make it something that's living and breathing and folks feel connected to, is one of the biggest, I would say, challenges, but also oversights that a lot of companies make. Specifically, and I feel like I can say this as a CEO, I think a lot of times that C-level, especially a CEO, believes that if they say the strategy or the vision for the organization at a company kickoff, then everybody remembers it. And the reality is that that's not the case, right? Folks have to hear, what is it, like minimally 10 times for it to really stick. And I think that is something we just see so consistently, is a CEO, an executive team communicates something once a year, once a quarter, and expects that to stick. And it just oftentimes doesn't.
Yeah, if the question is around common mistakes, correct? Is what the okay. I think there's three. One is expecting too much on the first time you've ever done this. So if your organization, this is all new to you, understand really at the beginning, you're trying to create clarity and alignment. That's really what your ultimate goal is let me get everybody aligned. I think that's organizations that are expecting like monumental changes right in the first quarter after doing this, that's a little too unrealistic. So be patient with the process, because it's going to be the second half of the first time you do this of the year, or maybe even the beginning of year two, where you really start to see precision enter the picture. And so that's one. A second one, I would say, that we see as self-facilitation. We see organizations that we'll just do this ourselves, and that's fine. We applaud those organizations that do that. But here's the risk in that. There's two. One is you can't facilitate and participate. So usually it's the head of strategy or whomever that really needs to be amongst the group designing, not with the one with the pen and facilitating. But the other risk in that is usually the one that's holding the marker is the one that's perceived as the owner of the strategy. And organizations that do that, they're setting themselves up for failure, because it disenfranchises all the people that are contributing to the design, because they're going to say that's the CEO's plan or that's the CFO's plan. And they're not going to feel a sense of ownership, which is setting you behind the eight ball. And then I think the third and kind of final mistake that we see is the communication breakdown. They design an amazing plan. They don't have the right platform. They find themselves concentrating all the power and knowledge at the top. And the people, again, we talked a lot about that today, but the people that really execute the plan are underinformed. So they go about their business as usual. And that's where things break down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We had one other that ties back to what we were talking about with the operating metric itself. And should everything tie to that? Every objective, everything that we're doing tie back to like a single operating metric itself? And I don't know if they all necessarily have to immediately connect to that. I do think that if that is something that the organization is anchoring around, then that's where those themes become really valuable because they contextualize a revenue number to different areas of the organization, right? If you have an engineering team or product team, directly saying, I'm building this to generate this revenue is not super feasible. What we can say though is, hey, when we evaluate net new product features or net new releases or enhancing existing features for our customer base, what are the outcomes that we expect to influence based on those efforts and energies that we're putting into that? And I think that's where, from a cultural perspective, you get folks much more bought into understanding, hey, we as an organization evaluated these different things and said, this is what we want to focus on because this is what we expect to happen. And then being able to go back and actually, again, hold yourselves accountable to, did we actually influence it? I think oftentimes folks lose sight of, it doesn't have to be an outcome delivered or realized right here and now, but it can be us saying, here's what we expect to happen. Now let's measure it. Let's get better about building our strategy. And so I don't know if Dave, you all see something differently, but when we talk about like operating plans and metrics themselves, like, yes, there is a few layers that have to come in and not every individual contributor is going to say, here's how it directly ties in. But I do think that there needs to be that conversation where folks understand that decisions are being built around those things so that they don't have that whiplash.
I'd answer the person who asked the question is yes, it should align. And so there needs to be the themes or the priorities, you know, again, we use different vernacular, but they're the same thing. Those things, why have 3 to 5 themes that don't align to something? Because again, then you're scattering your efforts and you're scattering all the value and synergies that you could create by aligning them to something. So I like that you had in a parentheses the letter S, because it could be operating metrics, it could be a couple key things, but it shouldn't be a whole lot. And there are different ways to design this, and there's different school of thought. Some of it could be a singular number, some of it could be a statement that you're aligning your strategic plan to. I think we all agree it should align to your mission, vision, and values. It should not be in conflict with those, but the answer is yes, it needs to align to something. So otherwise, it's hard to be strategic and look and be forward thinking if you're only living in the here and now.
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll take one more here.
Sure.
How can we balance constant strategic planning and reviewing while remaining agile?
Yeah.
I think that is one of the things that Dave was probably speaking to with the idea of being dynamic in how not only the strategy is set, but then also revisited on a regular cadence. And I think what we want to do is, and this is what we recommend with customers, build almost built-in checkpoints along the way, asking that question of, do we keep going? Is this what we see as the direction of the business itself? Versus do we go chase and explore another opportunity? I think so often that question is riddled with it depends. But the one thing I will share in this is that what can't happen is we can't be changing our strategy, quote unquote, every 2 weeks or every month. There has to be, we say like it has to be locked in for at least a certain period of time of what we are expecting. And again, it comes back to asking the question of what do we expect to happen and when at the onset. If we don't ask that to begin with, then we don't have a good measurement or barometer for when we should be thinking about pivoting, because it was just somebody had a great idea in a meeting. We didn't talk about it beforehand. Whoever was the most eloquent though in pitching that potential idea and why we should pivot over here, they're going to win the day in that conversation. And now all of a sudden you're going to be running in that direction without an expected outcome that we actually are measuring against itself. So I do think that again, those rituals that are being built in will help reinforce the way in which we make those decisions collectively as an executive team. But Dave, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I'll make it brief. I know we're at the end of time, but I find agile organizations are highly disciplined organizations. They're focused. They're focused on sprints. So I actually think agile organizations are actually able to adjust to being strategic better than organizations that waterfall and kind of are more methodical about the way that they go about things. So I actually think being strategic allows the agile process to have even more impact, frankly. So I think I think the two go together very well.
Yeah. So we spent a whole hour there talking about
Yeah,
how to
goodness
apply
gracious.
strategic planning. And we cannot thank everyone enough for taking the time here today to join us to go through a full perspective on where we at as an overall economic landscape. How is that impacting the way that organizations are going about strategic planning? And then how do we start to simplify it? How do we get back to the basics or really bring change about as we go into the fall, as we go into, for so many organizations, planning for next year? Dave and I have talked about this, but we're super excited we work together. There's no two ways about that in partnership. Elate is a software platform, and Velocity Advisory Group comes alongside organizations and how they consult and really serve the organizations that they partner with. And one of the things that we found a ton of success with is just getting back to the basics with those companies of just, hey, if you're struggling to put together a strategy to get that buy-in and alignment from the onset, I cannot recommend getting a third-party outside resource to facilitate those conversations, because there's just so much baggage, so much oftentimes politics that comes into those discussions. And the starter package that we've done with so many folks now of building a strategy, seeing that then come to life in a unified view, is something that we're super passionate about. And so if there's ever any chance that we could help folks out on this call, please don't hesitate to reach out. But Dave, really enjoyed the time today and putting this together.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks to Tim and Abby for helping us get this set up. And Brooks, appreciate you hosting today and look forward to hearing any questions that the group had. So appreciate everything. Yeah, good
Yeah, a
time.
lot of people behind the scenes that made this happen. Tim, Abby, Nathan, a lot of folks that brought this into reality. So thank you all. And again, if you have any questions or follow-ups and you want to reach out to Dave or myself, our emails were up there. But thank you all for the time today.